Afters by Oleanderhoney. Chapter 4. Thursday. Summary. Just another rainy Thursday. Jane has nicknames for everybody. It is equal parts irritating and amusing. The latter, especially if they are directed in Mycroft's direction. He was particularly fond of Mycroft's newest one, Emperor of Cake, that he plugged it into his contacts. He was less amused at the slew of his own nicknames. Mr. Science Man, Mr. Cambridge, and Clever McSmarty were some of the worst. But the fact that she did it purely to goad him made it okay somehow. It was a trait of hers that, despite himself, he actually found rather endearing. Not that he would ever admit it, of course. So it wasn't a surprise, really, when she spoke up one evening and announced, "Roger." She puts down her novel decisively. "What are you on about?" Sherlock says, plucking a few chords on his violin and staring into the fire. "Your skull. We should call him Roger." "What? Why?" Sherlock lowers his instrument and looks at her, taken aback. "Like the pirate flag, you know? Jolly Roger." She smiles and chuckles under her breath at her own joke, and continues reading. Sherlock's eyes slide to the skull on the mantel. He almost forgot. Well, no, he didn't, but he wanted to forget. Just for a little while. "I don't understand your obsession with nicknames, Jane. It's rather childish." He snaps acerbically. Jane blinks up at him with wide eyes. "Grumpy tonight, aren't we?" she remarks. Her teasing tone makes his temper flare. He gets to his feet in an angry huff. It's not his name, all right?" he says, his voice raising to a shout. And he puts his violin back in the case. He turns around and finds that she's standing there in front of him. "Sherlock." She reaches out to him, but he flinches back. "It's Wednesday," he says by means of explanation, and brushes past her to his room, much to her bewilderment. He doesn't emerge for the rest of the night. He can't bear her penetrating gaze that seems to see more than he wanted. He can't surface through the mire of his thoughts. Jane wakes up the next day to the sinking, sighing sounds of Sherlock's violin. Quietly, she ventures downstairs and stops in the doorway. Sherlock sways side to side with his back to her to the somber notes and phrases, and he pulls the bow across the strings with a reverence that makes something in Jane's chest flutter and pound. It is joy and sorrow, the light after dark, grief like the smell of rain, and catharsis like the sun breaking through the clouds. It makes the corners of her eyes sting with unshed tears, and she quietly retreats back to her room to compose herself. Later, she comes back downstairs, and Sherlock is still at the window, the violin hanging loosely at his side. Rain is coming down in sheets outside and breaking against the glass, distorting the view. It's hypnotic, and Sherlock is transfixed, his brow furrowed and his eyes hard. Jane knows better than to disturb him, and makes her way to the kitchen to make some tea. She brings the second cup, just the way he likes it, milky and sweet, out to him, and sets it on the desk. She comes to stand beside him and gently fixes his blue dressing gown that has slipped off one shoulder, and she turns and leaves for work without saying a word. The day passes by rather uneventfully, and Jane can't help but check the messages on her phone obsessively. It wasn't unusual for Sherlock not to text, but in conjunction with his volatile shift in mood the night before, and this morning's display, Jane worried for her friend. Something about his latest view was off. She was used to his pensive silence, but there was a darkness behind his eyes that spoke of something deeply troubling. She thought about texting him, but she dismissed the thought, knowing it wouldn't do any good anyway. Late that night, she comes back to the flat laden with takeaway, and she can hear the violin again from the street through the open window. What Sherlock was doing with the window open at the beginning of April, she didn't know. She comes up the stairs and takes the kitchen entrance so she can put their dinner down on the counter. Sherlock probably wouldn't eat, but she hoped the gesture would at least be acknowledged. Her ears perk up when she hears a clatter and a low curse uttered from the sitting room. "Sherlock," she says, coming through the door, just as Sherlock grabs his bow that had fallen to the ground. He pauses for a fraction of a second and then starts up again. This time, Jane listens where she hadn't been listening before. She hears the faint grind of horsehair and string, and the failing vibrato. To someone who hadn't listened to Sherlock play for hours on end, it would sound nearly perfect. But Jane could hear the imperfections, the occasional flat note, and the frequent legato, or perhaps staccato was warranted. She sees how his arms tremble with the effort, and how every note gleaned from the instrument seemed to be physically painful. She comes up behind him and puts a hand on his shoulder. "Sherlock," she says again. He doesn't stop, and Jane finally notices the state of the fingers on his left hand. They're coated in blood, both dry and fresh, and every time he lifts them, they stick to the fingerboard, causing his hand to tremble before pressing down once more. She gasps and tries to turn him to face her, but he resists her. "How long have you been playing?" she tries. Still no response. "Sherlock, stop!" "I can't!" he roars, whipping around to face her, clutching his violin around the neck. The bow lands on the floor again, and Sherlock pants through his clenched teeth, eyes wild. Jane doesn't even flinch. "Why?" she asks in a hushed voice. He turns away from her and runs a hand through his ragged curls. "It's Thursday," he says, his voice gravelly. Thursday? What was so important about today? She tries to rack her brain for any significance of today's date, but she draws a blank. Not knowing what else to say, she puts her hand on his back again. When he doesn't shrug her off, she slowly reaches down and takes the violin from Sherlock's slackening grasp. She sets it down on the desk and notices with dismay the tea from earlier, untouched. Jane takes him by the wrist and guides him to sit in his chair. He complies without argument, and she goes upstairs to retrieve her first aid kit. When she comes back down, she finds Sherlock leaning against the mantel with a glass of scotch, staring at the skull. "I didn't know we had scotch," she remarks. He grunts noncommittally and drains it with shaking hands. She leads him to the sofa and sits across from him on the coffee table. Gingerly, she takes his hand and rests it in her lap, palm up, and as gently as she can, she washes the dried blood off of his fingers with a warm flannel. He doesn't even blink as she cleans the cuts with antiseptic and plasters them one by one. It's Thursday, Sherlock says again, barely above a whisper. That's 10 years now. And suddenly it hits her. A conversation they had a little over a week ago. Did you have a falling out with Victor too? Is that why I've never heard of him? Sherlock's smile fades and his eyes darken. No, he died. Oh, Sherlock, Jane says, and Sherlock goes to put his head in his hands. He hisses in pain, however, and drops them limply in his lap. Let me see, she says, and he holds his hands back out to her. She takes the right one and gently massages his swollen wrist. This is what happens when you play for 12 hours straight, you great git, she says affectionately. She presses her thumbs into the center of his palm and rubs outward, easing the stiffness, and closes his eyes. Victor was an art student. Wanted to be an architect. He had an affinity for bark, Sherlock says. He opens his eyes and trains his gaze on a point over her shoulder. Jane laces her warm fingers through his long, dexterous ones and rotates his hand, flexing it slowly from side to side. She takes to the left one, minding his bandages, and he tips his head back to rest against the wall. After she's finished massaging his hands, she sits next to him on the sofa. You really cared for him, didn't you? She asks softly. He turns to look at her, and she is struck by his gaze. All of the pain and sorrow that he imbues into his violin is written like a score in his opalescent eyes. He turns away from her. Caring is not an advantage, he says as if by rote. Who told you that? Jane asks. It doesn't matter, he says, and closes his eyes, that detached mask sliding back into place once more. They're wrong, you know, she whispers. She's not sure if he heard her, but words never mattered to Sherlock like actions did. So she guides him down so he could rest on his side, with his head in her lap. He goes willingly and sighs deep in his chest. The rain picks up again, and Jane can hear the sound of distant thunder. She runs her fingers through his hair, content to listen to the metallic patter of raindrops against the gutters of 221B. Her mind wanders, and her eyes drift around the room. They rest on the small carriage clock on the mantel. Sherlock, she says, smoothing the hair back from his temple. At first she thought he fell asleep, but after a moment he turns on his back with a question in his eyes. It's midnight, she says, and shows him her watch. The corner of his mouth curls up in a soft smile. Friday, he says. The end.